So I am very happy to welcome you. Good evening. Oh, come on. Good evening. Good evening. To one of my favorite places at Georgetown. It's wonderful to have you here. So on behalf of the Center on Faith and Justice at Georgetown, we want to just tell you how grateful we are for this event, amazing event, and for you all being with us tonight. I'm Jim Wallace. I'm Chair of Faith and Justice at Georgetown and the founding director of our Center on Faith and Justice. At the Center, we are deeply committed to empowering the moral and spiritual dimensions of public policy. We believe that civic engagement for us means social justice, but also the nourishing of our interior lives, which in days like this are more important than ever. So this will be hopefully a challenging event, but I hope a nourishing event as well for all of you. We have the privilege of hearing from some remarkable voices who will challenge us to think more deeply about resistance and resilience. Resistance is coming for all of us, I think, but we need resilience to undergird our resistance. So this will be a moment of when authoritarianism, misogyny, and the politics of domination are all on the rise. Every day I get calls from colleagues and friends saying, it's getting worse and worse, isn't it? I said, yes, it is, but resilience will be called for from all of us. So, how we can build a politics and a society rooted in justice, dignity, and hope. And Desmond Tutu, who my chair is named after, taught me the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is often a mood or a feeling. He said it's deeper than that. Hope is a choice, a decision you make because of this thing that we call faith. So to help guide us this evening, I'm honored to introduce my colleague, Dr. Kathleen Bonnet. Dr. Bonnet is the academic program manager at the Center on Faith and Justice. She also teaches theology here at Georgetown. Dr. Bonnet holds a doctorate from LaSalle University, and her focus areas include moral theology, Catholic social thought, Augustinian spirituality. She's got a PhD in Augustine, so she may or may not bring Augustine in there, I'm not sure. And ecofeminism. We're very proud to have her on our team. She's the author of Revolutionary Hope, A Spirituality of Encounter and Engagement in an Evolving World. You can find her scholarly writing in sources like the Journal of Moral Theology, the Journal of Catholic Social Thought, and for public opinion pieces, look for her byline in America, the Jesuit Review, U.S. Catholic, and the Millennial. She is well published and a very popular teacher here at Georgetown. So join me in welcoming Dr. Bonnet and the panel. Let's give them some love.
Thank you for being here with us, everyone, and thank you, Jim, for that introduction. I'm really delighted to be here moderating this conversation. We'll have a conversation among the panelists, and then we'll make sure to save time at the end for Q&A from all of you, so be thinking of your questions. And I will ask my colleague to give me a signal around 8 o'clock when we should wrap up here. The systems that shape our lives, particularly our political system, were not designed with women in mind. In fact, they were designed in ways that actively excluded women and people of color and anyone who was non-white and non-male. Identity politics, we could say, has been at the heart of our systems of government. And we see that those through lines of racism and misogyny woven through our political activity today. And yet, women persist. And we show up and turn out for the causes that mean the most to us. despite the political impediments and the cultural barriers. And so this conversation, I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I'm hoping that this conversation will be about the misogyny that's baked into our political systems, but also what we can learn from the resilience of women who persist within and despite them. In a time when so many of us are feeling overwhelmed by the politics of domination that we're seeing and the ways in which our institutions and norms and programs and the things we depend upon are being manhandled, how can we counter the patriarchal systems that lead to that? How can we respond to misogyny and violence with integrity and justice? So this conversation will highlight the experience of women, but it's not only for or about women. It's about the broader paradigm of power that we embrace as a society. It's about understanding how we might reimagine power in a way that benefits and is for the good of us all. So I am honored to explore those questions with this wonderful panel. Peggy Flanagan is the Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota. She's a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and currently the country's highest-ranking Native woman serving in executive office. At the center of her work is making progress for children, working families, communities of color and indigenous communities, and Minnesotans who have historically been underserved and underrepresented. As Lieutenant Governor, Peggy co-chairs the work of the Young Women's Initiative to center the voices of young women in the work of state government. She delivered the largest tax cut in Minnesota history, paid family and medical leave for the state, and free school meals. A former Minneapolis school board member and state representative, Peggy also previously served on the board of Sojourners under Jim Wallace. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education at American University in DC, where she is also the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL. She regularly testifies before the US Congress and briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies on the US, the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. She's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books, including the forthcoming Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. Dr. Jamil Scott is an assistant professor of political science in the government department here at Georgetown. She earned her PhD in political science from Michigan State University. Her research interests focus on the political behavior of political elites and the mass public in the United States, particularly emphasizing how race and gender impact political decision-making. She makes use of various methodological strategies in her work to capture the way in which identity shapes political life. In addition, her work has been published in journals such as Politics, Groups and Identities, Journal of Race, Ethnicity and Politics, American Politics Research, and the Journal of Politics. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Thank you. Yes. To get us started, I want to just open with a question for all of you. And that is, why are you here tonight? And what I mean by that is, with everything going on, all of the things that we could be responding to and could be doing, what was it that drew you to this conversation? And what is the urgency of this moment? We'll start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, Buju, Peggy Flanagan, Indigenous Kaz, Gijuwewe Damakwe, and Go, Goabaga, Ganikagdan Dunjaba, Mangan Dame. My English name or my American name is Peggy Flanagan. My name in Ojibwe speaks in a loud and clear voice woman. I'm a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, and my family's the Wolf Clan. And the role of our clan is to be the protectors of the community and ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind. So that's part of the reason why I'm here tonight. I also will do just about whatever Reverend Wallace asked me to do and asked me to be a part of. He is really important for our family and kind of like my adopted dad, and I'm so grateful for him. And I would just say I'm also here because we need you. We need you to be engaged and involved in this moment, and especially for the young people who are here. I want you to feel hopeful, and I'm going to quote Jim Wallace, which is, "Hope is believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change." And I think that is what we are to do in this moment. Some people who have said, like, why do you keep doing this work? Why do you keep showing up? What is the other choice? And I think for so many women, that has been just how we have lived our entire lives and existence, continuing to show up and do the work that needs to be done. And I was raised by a whole bunch of women who are leaders, and I didn't know that women didn't do anything else other than lead and participate in community. So that's why I'm here, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Dr. Scott.
That is a hard act to follow. But, you know, I would say I'm here because in this moment, I think it can be really easy to go off in your silo, to be sad, to be just afraid about what's happening. And I think this is not to say that there isn't room for concern, right? All action in the ways in which people choose to act starts with some level of concern. So that's not to say that there isn't room to be concerned, but with that concern, I think there's room to think about what does action look like? What does activism look like in your own spaces? And so I'm here to think through, to be a part of this conversation around this moment and what does it look like from a race and gender perspective?
Well, thank you for having me, and also both hard acts to follow. I would say I'm here probably for two reasons. One, because Reverend Wallace asked me, and as a former PK, not just a former PK, as a PK, a preacher's kid, and a child who grew up on a college campus with a dad who was a chaplain, anytime anyone who has the word Reverend in front of their name asks me to do something, I say yes. And but that, you know, I'm making light of it, but also I mean that because it's a conversation that I don't get to have very often in my ordinary life. Anything about religious values, personal values, or human values don't really come in as much to the equation of a very social sciencey world where I spend my days. And so I was intrigued and thought this would be an interesting conversation. And I also thought on the intellectual side or on the policy side, I probably have something to add to the conversation about the online worlds that young people inhabit and how misogyny is exploding there and what that looks like. And so, but I think it's a moment to have these conversations in a way that is integrative of our whole lives, more holistically, and I don't see that very often, certainly not on my own campus enough. So.
Thank you so much. Lieutenant Governor, we'll start with you. Given your history and your experience and how your work centers Indigenous communities and communities of color, how it centers women and children, can you speak to how your personal experience has shaped your policy priorities and your political engagement? And I would love to situate this in the current context where, of course, we know that even the words women and Indigenous communities are being erased from our federal government.
And yet, we're still here. Yeah, I grew up thinking that the bottom could fall out at any moment. And there are a whole lot of people who feel that way right now. My mom moved us to the community of St. Louis Park, where I still live with my family right now, using a Section 8 housing voucher. We relied on public programs like SNAP, which back in the day we called food stamps, and I was that kid with the different colored lunch ticket. The Child Care Assistance Program allowed my mom to go back to school, get her certificate in phlebotomy, and help to lift our family into the middle class. And I'm sitting here alive today because of Medicaid as a kid who had severe asthma, and sometimes I was in the hospital more than I was out. So that informs the work that I do, because a lot of times at the Capitol, the Minnesota Capitol, and I think it probably happens here too, we hear a lot about those people. I am those people, and those people should have a seat at the table to help co-create our future and what that looks like. And so in this moment where many of those programs, right, that have been there to lift people into the middle class, to lift people out of poverty, which I think have been important safety net programs and important investments in just community and stability and the future of our state and country. That informs my work because I see when you increase family income, you improve child outcomes, and really it's that simple. If you're not going to do it out of the goodness of your heart, like you should do it because it's the right thing to do for the economy and for our future. But I'd also say this, that as an Indigenous woman in this role, I know that our democracy functions best when it accurately reflects the people it seeks to represent. And so by being the first, my job is to make sure I'm holding the door wide open for other people who can come after me, but also knowing that the system has been working exactly the way that's been supposed to work by the folks who set it up, and we can disrupt the system and get better outcomes when we have people with different lived experience who are part of it. So I feel that. I also know that in this moment where people are afraid or uncertain, and that sometimes it feels like we just want to tap out. And I get that, and you have to take care of yourself in this moment because this is going to be work for the long term. That Indigenous women have been leaders since time immemorial. It is simply the rest of society that is catching up. And I think I am often reminded by my aunties who hold me accountable that we have been through hardship before. And for so many different reasons and in so many different ways, I shouldn't even exist, right, or be here. And yet, Native women have always been here, are still here, and will be here into the future. And I think if there is some comfort that we can also gain from that, I think it's important to express that in this moment. We have seen incredibly difficult times before and have come out on the other side. And that's because we've taken care of each other, we've linked arms, we've leaned in hard to community and to kinship, and we are in one of those moments where we need to do that again.
Thank you so much, and for your witness of resilience. And we'll come back to talk about what it looks like to lean in in a little bit. Dr. Scott, I want to talk to you a little about those barriers that Lieutenant Governor Flanagan mentioned. You've written a lot on the historical and cultural barriers to particularly Black women and other women of color entering politics or engaging in politics in various ways, from running to office to voting to and everything in between. And so, we know there's underrepresentation. So I would love to hear you speak to us a little bit about some of the challenges that your research has identified.
Yeah, so I think just one of the challenges that we can think about, and to echo your point, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, about there's nothing new under the sun. I think some of those same challenges that women of the past saw are coming back today, right? These ideas around your last name, right? And what does it mean to change your last name in this moment where there are real conversations around voter ID laws and new conversations around voter ID laws, right? And how difficult it can be to vote, right? If your name doesn't match what is on your ID at the time that you go to vote. And not to mention conversations around gender for folks who are trans-identifying and how their IDs will not match given the administration's stance, right? In my work and thinking about folks who decide to run for office, it tends to be those folks who are the participators, the folks who are the doers, who are showing up consistently, right? But it can often be the case that money can be the hard part of the conversation, right? Particularly at a time where running for office and political acts more generally require a lot of money, right? So as we think about just what does it mean to be active? What does it mean to participate? I want to speak to this point about how your donor dollars matter too, right? Because that can be the difference for folks who are running for office, the folks that parties aren't necessarily paying attention to, but outside organizations are, right? There's a big story, or the story around organizations like Emily's List is that though they choose the people that maybe the parties aren't looking at, but even they don't get it right all the time. And what do I mean by that? We can think about the Congresswoman from Massachusetts, Ayanna Pressley, right? She did not get that endorsement from Emily's List, right? They didn't think she was gonna make it, right? At first. They came on board later, but at first they didn't think she could do it, right? But it was other organizations who were investing, other PACs that were investing in her as a candidate that made the difference for her at the early stages that made Emily's List come on later on, right? But we forget the piece that money can play. And I don't want you to think that I'm asking you to turn out every dollar that you have, right? That is not this conversation. It is thinking about how small dollars can matter too, right? And so, sometimes during election season, they're like, what does it matter to give up your coffee, right? Because they want you to donate to their campaign. But that $10 can mean something, particularly when it's added to somebody else's $10 and another person's $10. Those types of things matter, not just from a campaign perspective in terms of who's going to run, but how you're investing in political movements and organizations and what they're doing, right? And even social organizations. There are organizations on the ground who are doing some really pivotal work, and your $10 can matter, right? For their ability to house, clothe, help, etc. And all of those things are a part of the mission and the conversation right now. And I say the mission and the conversation because as Lieutenant Governor Flanagan mentioned, that some of the institutions, some of the programs that we tend to think about as life-preserving, life-helping for folks are going away, right? That at a time where we're already at higher inflation, at a time where, we are having real conversations about eggs and how many eggs you can get at the grocery store, right? These types of programs being at risk is a real problem. So, but not just about money, right? And what we can do, it's also about how we think about structuring our day, right? There's a concept from scholars in thinking about what does the double day and the triple day look like, right? And what I mean by that is that we often think about your work day and your home life, but is there space to think about another part of your life, your organizing life, your assisting life? How are you engaged in your community, right? And I know that there are only so many hours of the day, but I think I challenge you all to think about what does it look like to give your time in some capacity? What does it look like to share, help, serve in some capacity, even if it's just an hour a week, or just thinking beyond ourselves in this moment where it can be really easy to turn in, right? Because there are communities that don't have the option to turn in. They have to keep pushing and looking outward because if they don't, who else is going to do it, right? And for many women of color, it's like they're often thinking about, if not me, then who else, right? And so there are women in this moment who are thinking, I still need to show up regardless of what other people's decision making is. Their third day is not an option. It is for them a requirement. It's something that they feel like they have to do. So when I'm asking you about not your third day, your triple day, when I'm asking you about what your triple day looks like, I'm not asking you to give of everything that you have. I know there's only so much that we can do. And at a time where things are really hard, you should be concerned about your mental health, right? Be concerned about what is in your cup to pour and what you have to keep for yourself. But with that, right, there are people doing a whole lot of pouring, and it would be helpful if we are in the collective, if their water is not the only water in the bowl. I'll say it like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm hearing that theme of leaning in, right? That solidarity there. So thank you, both of you. We'll come back to that. Dr. Miller-Idriss, so we're hearing about the underrepresentation of women in politics, the barriers here. And I want to bring up a recent Washington Post article that found that many young men are being drawn into the language was destructive political movements because recent social movements have tended to champion feminist causes, like the examples used were Me Too and the Women's March, while at the same time seeming to kind of ignore or denigrate even the concerns that young men have. And so there's also, a 2020 UK survey that found that half of young men found that feminism has gone too far. And we've also seen an uptick in violence among teenage boys. I mean, there's a whole increase in this kind of thinking. I would love to hear your reflections on this disconnect between the reality of the underrepresentation of women, particularly in politics and other leadership roles, and this sense that men are being left behind. What's happening there, and what's the effect it's having?
Well, I think if you haven't seen Adolescence yet on Netflix, I encourage that, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say is echoed in this series that is explaining a little bit what the online lives are like for a lot of boys and young men. So I think one of the things you have to do is hold multiple things in your hands at the same time, right? So first of all, there is a very real crisis of boys and young men in particular, and men, older men, in terms of the data showing that 50% of men say their online lives are more rewarding than their offline lives. They have 3/4 of the deaths of despair, which is suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. They have 25% of young men under the age of 30 say they don't have a single friend. Something like over half of 18 to 23-year-olds agree with the statement that, quote, no one really knows them, right? So this sort of loneliness epidemic, and what that does to create vulnerabilities among young men in particular to a framing that involves scapegoating for who is to blame for the set of problems that they face, right? So real or perceived, but there is a real crisis. There's also some perceived disadvantage that is sometimes comes from a narrative online that says all this language about fairness has disadvantaged you. And actually feminists and others, often immigrants, Jews, take your pick of a variety of scapegoats, are the ones who are responsible, or DEI itself, or social justice, or the concept of fairness or equity, that this is disadvantaging you. And that frame has been sold in a very compelling way by influencers online who often charge a subscription rate for outrage, essentially, right? They're packaging it as outrage. It is addictive sometimes, and ever more salacious. And so you get someone like Andrew Tate, who starts every video with the phrase, men are suffering and I'm the only one who will talk about it, and then goes on to tell you how to exploit women, right, with a package of subscription courses that involve exploitation and abuse of women, so for profit, but has an approval rate that's higher than Joe Biden among 18 to 22-year-olds, right, in the US, and 1 in 5 young men in the UK think highly of him, right? So he's and there's 1,000 guys like that, right? It's not just him, but he's a very successful one. So I think, that can be true. All of those things can, you can have real suffering. You can have a real sense of loneliness, a crisis of isolation, and uncertainty and sometimes find influencers online by searching for things like, how do I get my life together, and getting advice that then starts with some things that might be like reasonable, like make your bed, and get 8 hours of sleep or drink more water, and then comes with like all the scapegoats that are to blame for the problem. So, I think that a lot of young men and boys are in need of open spaces to have conversation about the kinds of things that they're seeing, the violent porn, the violence in general, misogynistic violence and racist things that come across their feeds. That every time I have this conversation on a college campus, the people who come to me afterward are the mothers of boys and young men themselves, because they haven't had a space to talk about it, right? It's not that women don't want to talk about it, but they do talk about it, right? But often high school boys and college-age young men do not have a space to talk about what is coming across their feeds, or they feel guilty or ashamed. They think it's their fault that the algorithm has dropped this into their feed. And then they get seduced and drawn into it. So I think that part of it can be true, and it can still be true that women are underrepresented and people of color are underrepresented, and we still don't have equal pay, and we don't have, right? So that it's perception and reality all blended together, but it's, I think, meeting a narrative online. What I often say is, we have a very real crisis of boys and men. There's no reason why that had to become a crisis of misogyny until you look at what happens online, and then you understand how that connects.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, in past interviews, you've expressed concern about the kinds of comments that you and other women receive online. And you've suggested that we need to shift our cultural paradigm away from this patriarchal, misogynistic paradigm towards, I'll let you speak to towards what, but that it's for the sake of our boys and our girls, right? It's not, feminism is not about girls, right? Although it is that too. And so you've actually said, and I'm going to quote you here, that it's not easy to run against misogyny and racism and bigotry. Having women in leadership isn't cosmetic, it's essential. And so in that context, I would love to hear you unpack that a bit for us.
Sure. Yeah, I did say that. So yeah, I do want to just also just like briefly speak to something that Dr. Scott said too, because I think it's really powerful as you're talking about the third triple day. The triple day and how you're giving of your time and your talent and your treasure. I remember one day I was in a community called Little Earth, which is part of the urban Native community in Minneapolis. And there was a woman who was having an Indian taco sale, which is like fry bread tacos with like taco meat and ingredients on top, delicious. And she was having the sale out of her apartment. It's one of like how she lived, and one of the ways that she took care of her grandchildren. And she had this like Folgers coffee can, and she like dug into the can and she took $5 out and she put it in my hand and she said, "My girl, we're so proud of you." And she said, "Take this for your campaign." Now that $5 meant more to me than just about any other contribution that I got in that time. And that's because she felt like she had a stake in what was happening. She had influence, and I think like that is also this moment that we find ourselves in, why it is so important. And with these organizations where they may be dependent on, government funding or federal funding that could go away, we also have the power in this moment to continue to invest in the things that can make a difference. So I just felt the need to say that and just re-emphasize your point. So much of the shifting the paradigm, I think, also builds off of what we just talked about with young men and boys, which is that one of the epidemics of loneliness and disconnection and the parasocial relationships that we have with our phones, I think we are seeing that play out in the toxicity and the divisiveness that runs rampant in this country right now. And the act of gathering is one of the ways that we push back. The act of being in relationship with each other is one of the ways that we push back. And creating space where If there's someone who holds different political views than I do, if there's someone who has a different lived experience than I do, being willing for a moment, right, to hold that instead of push it away and react to it. Now, there are ways that we need to keep ourselves safe, and I want to just acknowledge that's part of this too. But the immediate reaction to reject instead of hold, I think, is one of the reasons why we're in this place we are too. And so one of the things that we are doing right now is that we're doing something called kitchen table conversations that we're holding all across the state of Minnesota. And it's not a town hall, because it's not like I'm giving a speech and then doing Q&A afterwards. It's really about hearing from people what worries you right now, who are you fighting for, and what brings you hope. Coming back to that word, right, hope. And having people who are coming together from all different walks of life, people who may have voted in a way that is different from others in the room. And instead of immediately rejecting each other, saying, like, we're actually all in this, and this is my opinion that I'm expressing here, is literally all of us against extremist billionaires who are profiting off of keeping us divided and keeping us from talking to each other. So that, I think, is one of the ways that we shift the paradigm, is reject the idea that we have to fall into a particular category, and that we can actually find and build these relationships and have common ground and push for things that I think are beneficial to folks, like increasing wages, right? Things like paid family and medical leave, things like, you know, childcare is not just good for women, and reminding people that issues around economic security and ensuring that people can imagine and have a future in their lives is one of the ways that we're also able to push back on some of the ways that people feel disconnected and that, you know, misogyny that is dominated. Like, we can give people an alternative and see that they have stake in each other, but that requires that we actually build these relationships and we listen and show up. And so that's one of the ways I think that we can respond in this moment. And I think people want a fighter, and they want fighters in this moment for their causes and for the things that they believe in. And one of the ways that we do that, I think, is getting away from some of the misogyny of the fight, but actually like being allied and like, I'm gonna look out for you and you're gonna look out for me, which is a very different way than how we've seen this approached in recent political history. That is where we find ourselves now. And it takes work, but I think it's good work if you can get it.
Thank you. Yeah, listen to each other and show up. That's great. I'm also thinking about how, you know, these patriarchal hierarchies that we build keep us in our places, right, or impose places, and prevents that listening to each other and that encountering each other on our own terms. So thank you. Thank you for that. Dr. Scott, as you're in all of your research, as you're thinking about the ways that these systems have not been designed with women in mind or other historically marginalized groups, there are plenty of women, you know, again, just thinking about the systems as opposed to the particular identities. There are plenty of women who step into these systems and perpetuate the same narratives of domination and hierarchy, right? So, but I would love to hear in your research what you're seeing has been effective from women who step into these systems and engage in the work of transformation.
Yeah, so I think there's something to be said about the power of coalition building and, you know, thinking about work not just from one perspective, right? So the really interesting thing about some of the work that I've seen about in women in office, right, is that they're not just thinking about an issue in one way, right? So, you know, the idea of safety, right? Or thinking about children, right? It's not just about a child's education, but then they're also thinking about safety and the implications of community, right? So they're seeing how all of these issues are multifaceted and not just one way, right? You can build coalition partners when you're thinking about the issue in a way that matters for not just your community, but somebody else's community, right? You can expand the conversation when you have folks who may not agree on one piece, but they're on board with some other piece, right? And so I'm saying that to say that from a legislative perspective, some of the women who've been most effective at the state level are the ones who've been able to build these coalitions with other people and people that you might not expect on the way that they talk about an issue, the way that the bill is structured, right? They're thinking about not just their coalition of the Women's Caucus, but they're thinking about the Black Caucus and how that might impact the Latino Caucus, right? They're building coalition partners across spaces to get other folks on board when the issue seems like this might be something that a lot of people might say no to. So from a legislative perspective, I'm seeing people who are like, I can see how you can benefit, and I'm going to bring you into the conversation, right? I'm going to shape this legislation in a way that seems feasible to you, because if it's framed in one way, you're out, right? But if we frame it in this broader context about how it impacts everyone, then you might just say yes, right? And sometimes it's, sometimes when we think about politics right now, it can often be in this conversation of how can I win my side alone, right? And we are in a very politically polarized time, right? And it can be really incentivized, or one can be incentivized as a politician or even as a person to say, I want my side to win, and that's it. Well, the way that institutions work, it makes it really hard for your side just to win because, right, you need someone to say yes, you need somebody to be on board, right? And not just one person, but you need multiple people to be on board for that bill to get out of, out of committee, for that bill to then get to the floor, right? And so, one of the things, and one of the most interesting pieces, right, is that the scholarship talks about women as being some of the most effective lawmakers because they're the ones who are willing to say, let's build a coalition, let's collaborate. Especially when they're not in power, right? When their party's not in power, they're like, how can we make this work? How can I be in conversation with you about how to build this conversation in the way that you might see it as meaningful to you too, right? And so I think what this means for all of us, right? And it's like Lieutenant Governor Flanagan spoke about, right, is that in a really polarized time, it's really easy to say, you have nothing to do with me. But that's not true, right? There's this book in political science called Bowling Alone, right, that we're not engaging with each other anymore, right? But I think we're at a time where most of us are in the home or at home, right? We're not engaging with each other, right? And the way to combat some of these really negative narratives about how things are and what's happening is to change that narrative, right? And I'll give you an example. When Kamala Harris was running for office, right, there was this narrative that Black men were not supporting her, right? We can, yes, there is 9% of Black men voted for Trump. Fair, that happens. But by and large, right, there's a whole other greater percent who showed up in support of her, right? But that conversation, right, about, oh, they aren't going to support her, and what about the men, right? Black men are being left out. Look at what the Democratic Party is doing, right? You even had James Carville saying this is a bad plan. So all this focus on Black women, we're leaving out men, right? What about Black men, right? This is awful. This is terrible, right? What I thought that was really interesting that I saw Black men doing was organizing their own Zoom calls, right, around their not just their support of Kamala, but conversations about the community, the community for Black men, and to, kind of combat what is this narrative that's being said about Black men, right? That they're being left behind, that they don't support this candidate running for office. What does that mean, right? And did it change the conversation that was happening completely? No, right? There's still some work to do on how we talk about men in the media. I think you would agree. But I think it changed a bit how they were talking about Black men in this context in the race, right? When they were coming together, when they were talking about their issues and what they needed to do, that spawned not just a Zoom call, but conferences. That spawned opportunities for Black men to be talking, not just Black men, Black women, Black communities to be talking about what is this narrative around the group that's being displayed, right? And sometimes it takes coming together to speak to, there is what is being said about us, what can we do to shift this? And the narrative that's being said about all of us, right, is that we are in the most polarized time ever, right? Our politics are really polarized, and there is some findings out there about like how some people won't even have car food with someone from a different partisan group, right? And so if we are that polarized, a conversation that's being had about all of us is we can't even sit and share some Splenda with, someone from the other party, right? And so I think doing the work speaks to how do we create a space, not just in legislatures, but in our communities, that we aren't all going to have the same ideology, the same beliefs, but we can agree that we want a space to exist. We want a good space, right? And how we get there, we might even disagree on that, but there's a goal, right? On having safe communities, right? Good communities where people can belong. And in some ways, people can just, they don't have to bowl, but maybe they can just come together and have a good old coffee about what that looks like.
Thank you so much. The importance of changing the narrative and speaking on our own terms, right? To shift how we think of each other. Thank you. Dr. Miller-Idriss, I want to sort of go back to something you mentioned earlier about the isolation crisis, and it's come up, as we're talking about building communities and how crucial that is to the work of transformation in politics. I think about Hannah Arendt, right, who's talked about how totalitarianism comes from isolation and loneliness, right? And so, particularly when there's a group who shares what she called a negative solidarity or a hatred of what is, and so they band together, right? And there's no positive vision there. So in your work, especially in these online communities, I would love to hear, first of all, what you make of that. And then if there's an element of faith in there, we're the Center on Faith and Justice, and so hope is a big piece of our work here and thinking about what our positive vision is. But in online communities, I know that often that hope and the ways faith is talked about is subverted. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts on that, and also on what my colleagues have said here on the panel. I think one of the things that might be helpful, I'm with my professor hat for a second, is I realize I'm halfway through the things I was going to say without having defined any of the terms that I am using. And so, I do want to just say that when we talk about misogyny, a lot of the common usage of that term is hatred of women, and that's not how I use it. I use it in Kate Mann's definition. If you haven't read Kate Mann, I highly recommend the philosopher Kate Mann's work on this, where she defines misogyny as the law enforcement function of the patriarchy, right? So if patriarchy is a system of power relations, of unequal distribution of power, like other systems of power relations, misogyny is the law enforcement function. It's a policing, right? And that means it can be a gender policing function that goes beyond the policing of women, too. It's about policing of gendered norms and expectations. When you look at it that way, you can see very easily that patriarchy hasn't been all that great for men either, for a lot of men, right? Because of this category of masculinity that boxes men into a kind of stoicism, of a lack of emotion and connectedness, of a rejection of a full spectrum of human emotions in a lot of places, and boys are often driven into that through bullying. Bullying of LGBTQ kids, of any kids who don't fit into that norm of being sufficiently feminine or sufficiently masculine according to what patriarchal norms and expectations say. And that means that the loneliness crisis gets harder for boys as they hit in adolescence. What we see from the research, like Niobe Way's work on this, that shows that when boys hit adolescence, they stop being physically intimate with each other because they're afraid they're going to be called gay by their friends. And they are called gay. When they used to hold hands or push, touch each other, throw their hands over each other, and cuddle up while they're watching movies as 8 or 9-year-olds, but by 10, 11, 12, 13, they start to reject that. And they very quickly have to work hard to put themselves in a box. And so one of the things that I've heard, I've interviewed boys and men my whole life in my career, and they will tell you things like, that they had to work really hard to reject and carve out those parts of themselves to fit in and not be bullied. And now, in this moment, they're being called to task for that, for not being sufficiently open to connection, right? But they can't do it anymore in many cases. They've learned not to reject that. So I think some of this conversation is about helping, and it's probably why high school boys and college men often come up to me afterward, because they want spaces to talk about this, to the way that they feel put in boxes, to the way that they feel they need places to have these kind of conversations. And without leaving those conversations open to people who give them answers, and answers that disparage, dehumanize, create desensitization of violence against others, which is where we are, right? Because there's so much vileness happening in online, in-game chats, in meme sharing, right? In the guise of jokes, of, in ways that create plausible deniability or just make it seem like it's not such a big deal to make light of the Holocaust or to tell your friend to go make me a sandwich, or whatever that is, that and you just can't take a joke, right? It's just a joke. And so I think understanding those worlds has to be a part of it, but not excusing those worlds because of the way you understand it. It's that, that balance of this isn't an excuse, but it's an explanation. And understanding that the worlds that we've created online for all young people haven't worked out that well for them either right now, and that they need ways to process that and to talk about it. And we find in our lab, we do a lot of tools for parents, and parents and grandparents across the spectrum politically are overwhelmingly worried about what their kids are doing and seeing online. It's the one place where we can find real serious political agreement. People really want to know what to do and how to change that, how to better equip themselves to recognize what their kids are seeing, whether that's pro-anorexia content for your girl, there's all kinds of difficult and bad content that's gendered and harmful, not just targeting boys. But I think when we're looking at the gender and polarization part of this, and the part that is driving boys to, and young men, so politically to anti-feminist conspiracy theories, to racist conspiracy theories, and to some of that acceptance, that's where the online content intersects with the kind of work that I do. Right.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we have time for one last question, so I'm going to pose a question to all of you and just kind of go down the line again before we open it up to the audience. So again, be thinking of questions you would like to ask. So from your research or from your years of experience in politics and community organizing and campaigning, what are the key insights that you can offer us tonight to help us challenge the dominant paradigm of power? What can we take out of this room to help us facilitate communities of flourishing?
All right. So I think there isn't just one answer. And I think people are looking for, in this moment, like, what's the one thing that I can do to push back in this moment? sorry to tell you, right? I don't know that there's just like one answer. I hope that you've actually heard a series of things. I certainly have from my colleagues on this panel. But I think we have a lot of tools in our toolbox right now, and we have to use all of them, and all of them at different points. And as an organizer, right, I care tremendously about being strategic in escalation and using different tools in our toolbox. So we're not just going to, start with a protest in front of somebody's office, right? But we can start with writing postcards, right? And letters to the editor. I think our stories are one of the most powerful tools in our toolbox right now. Being very clear about your own lived experience, how you are impacted or people you love and care about are impacted in this moment. It is harder for someone to reject you as a human being than it is to reject the facts, figures, and statistics. Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes people are like, did you read that article that I sent you? Are you not moved? Read it again, right? Versus, that's not actually how we connect. We have connected with each other through story for a very, very long time. I mean, being in a library right now, I think is powerful. So I think that matters, and I think showing up in solidarity with one another, if that's going to a community meeting, if that is a town hall, if it's literally what we are doing right now, if it is having someone's back in class when someone says something that maybe falls flat or needs some amplification, if it's running for political office, if it is pushing back in moments where maybe you feel a little nervous or you're afraid, that is what we are called to do in this moment. One of the things for me, especially right now, that has been incredibly important is just my faith community. We go to Mass every Sunday morning at 9:30. If we can't be there, then we put it on we're there at 3:30 on Saturday afternoon. And remembering that we don't have to do all this by ourselves, I think for me has been really important. That in my experience, there's something bigger than us, and we don't have to do it all alone, and that we have been sent other people in community to help carry this load, and that if in this moment you feel like, again, you have to tag out or it's too much, it's okay, that there will be other people who are going to continue doing this work, and then you can come back in when you need to. Because this has to be sustainable over time. And I'm saying that for you as much as I am also saying it for myself. And the way that I check myself is through Matthew 25, which is how we are caring for the least of these. And that is how I know, like regardless of what my job is, right, or my occupation, that in my vocation, I am always very clear. And if I am meeting that, then I am doing my job and where I need to be. And so this is one of those moments where I think we are called to think more about our vocation than our occupation. What is our role in this moment? What is our role in our community? What is our role in our family? What do you, Jim talks about this a lot. What do you lose track of time doing? That oftentimes is what your gift is in this moment to use for this work, and just really encourage you to think about that during this time.
Thank you. I think to add to those points, I'll say two things. First, that I think that people often get discouraged because institutions don't move how they want them to, right? That it's like I showed up, I called, I protested, I did all these things, and none of that moved the needle like I thought. Well, one of the things that I think is really important about politics, and particularly this political moment, is that we don't always see the needle being moved monumentally, but it's the small incremental changes that make a difference, right? The showing up, the indicator that you showed up, right? That tells your office holders, right, that matters, right? issue that matters to them. That is a form of public opinion that they're not getting, right? The showing up is an indicator for them that, somebody cares, right? And so, I think that oftentimes people get in this mode of it should all just shift because I stood here and I pushed, when we are all, the best analogy for is we are all the wolves blowing at the brick house, the little pig's brick house, right? Institutions are not straws that are blown down because we are upset about how things work or we want to get inside, right? They are brick houses, right? And we might be able to shift a little thing or get somebody to come outside, but our pushes in this moment, they shift things and they make a difference. That is not to say they don't make a difference, but they're not going to knock the house down. And I think that sometimes people get discouraged when they don't see the house on the ground. These things are brick, right? They're brick. And so, with that said, it also brings me back to the point that, there's nothing new under the sun. And a lot of the things that we see are organizational tactics being used over and over again, not because, it's nice to copy other people, but because these are things that work, right? And it is a learning of tactics, it's not just emulation, it's a learning of tactics that matter and have changed things, not just in the courts, right? In protests, right? There are different strategies that people have used that we know work, right? And so with that being said about there's nothing new under the sun, we've also seen people just be very discouraged about how that brick house did not fall down, right? With that being said, we look back on those movements and say, wow, right? They shifted the foundation. Look at that, right? And to them, it's like, that house is still standing, and I wanted it to be completely knocked down, right? And so I think part of this is that sometimes it's about shifting the foundation, and that the ways in which we might be thinking we're going to knock things down, maybe not in our lifetime, right? Maybe not in this moment. Maybe that comes later, but it's the shifting that matters, right? And it's the little things that you do in the moment, the conversations you start, the way that you think about how you conduct yourself in this moment, right? That can make a difference. And I think it's like you said, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, about standing up for something, right? Saying something about what you see. That can make the smallest difference in people's lives, and that is a shifting of the foundation. That's the shifting of the foundation that matters.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like I spent the first 15 years of my career working in Germany, as some of you know, and there's a German phrase that doesn't have a great translation, like so many German phrases, that says vorauseilende Gehörsamkeit, which is like hurry up to obey. I think the closest we have is comply in advance, but it's not quite the same. So, and this idea that we're all at this moment when there's so much erasure happening of words that are so important to so many of us, not just words, concepts, movements, right? Diversity, justice, right? Like, you can't put stratification now there's this absurd number of words that are being erased as that, and the idea that people will feel discouraged and think that that means that those ideas aren't valid, I think, or that you should erase those or not feel that they're important is, I think, one of the most harmful things that we're seeing right now is like a sort of culture shift away from that. And I think, one of the things I often talk about in my lab is that, which we're known, I think, for having creative, cutting-edge ideas that go outside the box of violence prevention work. And the reason for that is because we hire teams that are different from everybody else in the field. We bring in people who bring different personal backgrounds, professional backgrounds, disciplinary backgrounds, and that means they bring different ideas and experiences and generate creative options for how to engage that are different from a field that has been almost exclusively driven for many years by former law enforcement who do a good job but see things through a particular lens, are almost all men, and see this as a security problem, not a public health problem, not a problem of education or media digital literacy. And so I think, it's really important to lead with your values and to remember values. And that gets to this question about faith, I think, and to remember what you stand for wherever you are, if you're starting out a career or if you're in a leadership role, to not hurry up to obey something that goes against your values, and to try to keep standing up for the things that matter and that make a real difference in the work or in your lives or the lives of your neighbors and your community.
Thank you so much. Oh, yes. All right. Well, we can turn it over to you all. What questions do you have? Right up here.
Thank you so much.
Oh, there's a microphone coming for you.
Thank you so much to all of you for being here. This is really inspirational. My name is Maddie. I'm from Minnesota. I'm a first-year graduate student in the School of Foreign Service. I've also spent a lot of time at Little Earth, and I started something here called Come to the Table, very similar to, I think, kitchen table conversations. So thank you so much for being an inspiration. My question is for you, Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. I think we've talked a lot about centering community, listening, coalition building, Dr. Scott mentioned tonight. I'm wondering if you can help me unpack attention, or at least what I see as attention, which is, how do you reconcile, on the one hand, perceived power and economic empowerment, economic contribution being part of that, the fact that we also need to provide for ourselves, provide for our family, do that so we can hold ourselves up and have enough at the end of the day to also pour out for a 3-day, third day, triple day, for a triple day. And for the fact that the world sees money as power, and that's a reality in running a campaign or anything else. And on the other hand, doing the work of community organizing and listening and coalition building, which are often activities that are not paid or recognized as important, and yet they are. How do you, when you think about your career in public service and in public leadership, how do you hold those two things at once?
That's a great question. I think because of how I grew up, I think, and I'll be honest, like we bought our first house in October of like a year ago, and every morning when I wake up, I'm like, is this my house? Do I get to live here? Does my kiddo get to have a basement for sleepovers? Like, it's like that's real. And I say that because we have to acknowledge that people have to have their needs met. Right now, there's so many folks who are just surviving and are afraid. And so I think part of the work that we do is by making sure that people have access, and this builds on something that you were saying too. Like, I oftentimes think a lot about how Marian Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund would oftentimes talk about how children don't come in pieces. And I think we have to think about that too, right? That it's not just about having access to a good school. It's about making sure that you have food in your belly, that you know where you're going to sleep that night, right? That your parent has access to a job that has sustainable wages. And many of those things have to happen before people can feel like, okay, I can do something outside of myself. And that is just, I think, the reality for a lot of families. And there is a reason why our communities have been resilient, is that when we don't always have enough, or we're told there isn't enough, right? That many of us come from communities that are committed to abundance, regardless, right, of how much we actually have. It is the contribution and sharing of resources that is what I think has sparked a lot of movements and has been a place where a lot of folks have been able to thrive. We are being lied to right now that somehow there isn't enough. And that is, I think, the reason why so many of these things have been perpetuated right? Is that someone else has got theirs, so you can't have yours, right? Or there's like one piece of pie that everybody is fighting over, where actually like there is abundance, and if we came together, we would get the whole damn pie. And so that, I think, is, you know, our task right now, is to really illustrate that. But I also think, like, short answer, money in politics is a problem, right? And we have a lot of work to do. And it is one of the barriers, clearly, that we've talked about already. And so, you know, pushing for that reform is also part of it. But I think meeting people where they're at, and I think too often elected officials or campaigns expect people to come to them instead of going to where people are, which is one of the reasons why we're having these conversations where people feel comfortable in their own community. So I don't have a perfect answer, but I think there are things that we can rely on and traditions in our communities of abundance, and rejecting the frame that there simply isn't enough. There's plenty. It's just who has it and who's making us fight over this one damn piece of pie.
Thank you. Let's go on this side, back here. Yep, right there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. And this is like a hot potato question. What can you guys say about this conflict between faith as freedom and empowerment for women and people of color, but also faith as, you know, an instrument in the patriarchy for so many years of our history?
Thank you.
So that's a really interesting question, right? Because I think that we're at a time where there are a number of women scholars who are challenging these narratives around what was thought about as, you know, the interpretations that are traditionally assumed about faith and all of those things, you know, and I think that not just that, I think there are differences in faith traditions that can that matter as part of this conversation too, right? So I'll say that you know, one of the things that we can think about from a politics perspective is that the church has traditionally been a space where people have learned a lot of skills, right? Reading skills, right? But also just what does it mean to be engaged, right? It's churches that were organizing, shaping what politics, not shaping politics literally, that's illegal, but shaping, you know, how like being the space where people learned about where the political happenings were, how they would get there, even mobilizing people to vote, right? Thinking about the importance of those conversations, right? So there's that, and I think that for many people, that has been work that doesn't necessarily have a gender, right? People felt empowered in this space to do different acts, to be engaged, to participate. But I also recognize in ways that there are a lot of ways where these things can be very gendered, right? That there are positions where, you know, this is what women do, this is what men do in these faith traditions, particularly when we think about the church, right? But I think that there is a number of conversations that are being had right now about people pushing back around just the idea of how we interpret the stories, faith stories, right, around the Bible and what that means in particular. And that is not to say I'm a religion and politics scholar. I know enough to be dangerous about this topic. But what I will say is that there are differences in, people have found ways to be empowered, but it has also been ways in which these stories, these narratives, and how we think about who is at the head of churches and the stories that are around church can be ways in which people feel put down, right? And I think that that is something that the church structure has to consider, particularly in this moment, because, you know, there are a lot of people who are walking away because they don't like the stories that are being told, and how these gendered narratives push them in a box about what they can and can't do. And so, I think they're calling millennials and Gen Z the unchurched generations, right? They're going less, right? And so, again, not a religion and politics scholars, know enough to be dangerous. And I hope that I'm speaking to your question. But I think that one of the things that we're seeing is that people are walking away, and people who are stepping in, right? We're just seeing this really interesting. This is it might be a tangent, right? We're seeing this really interesting pattern of people trying to return to these traditions, these older traditions, right? Like this idea of trad wives. There's a lot of people making butter on TikTok, if butter making is your bag, you like a good garlic in your butter, sure, right? But I think some of this.
Don't make me have to.
yeah. And so I think some of what you're speaking to is that some of this is going to this conservative push to that, like, things were better when, right? And I think that part of the conversation that we all need to have is better for who, right? What does it mean that, women couldn't have a credit card, right? And, not everyone had, and we don't talk about equal pay because we still aren't there, right? But, working from home for some people, or being a homemaker, let me say, was not an option for everyone, right? So if we're talking about, like, who gets to churn and make the butter, that wasn't everyone, right? And so some people had to work. Maybe they made a good butter, for lack of a better term, and then they came home and did their work and then did something else too, right? Because they recognized the stakes were too high not to care about what was happening. So I hear you, and I hear the concern about what's happening and how there are a whole lot of conversations being had about how do we return back to the time, right? There's a lot of people who are like, I just want things back to the good old days. Good old days for whom? And so I think that is the narrative that we need to remember, because, there are a lot of cooking videos, churning, and like soft, quiet, like I made everything from scratch. That is wonderful for them. That is not my bag. And that is not to say it can't be your bag. If you love cooking, go off, be you. But that is not in the story that everything was better when we could all just make everything from home. Everything was better for whom? And who got to benefit? Because there's a reason why we had a feminist movement. There's a reason why, we're having these, there's a reason why people have been fighting and continue to fight for changes. And so as we think about how there are these pushes for more conservative values and to go back, right? It's important to consider where we came from and how there isn't anything new under the sun. And I'm sure back then there was somebody saying, actually, that lady's name was Phyllis Schlafly, was saying we should all just go back, right? So that argument isn't new either, right? It's just. And so and I'm sorry, this is a very long-winded answer, so I'll wrap up here. I think from all of these things are being wrapped up in culture and faith and how people are viewing the world right now. And so, I think the refrain that I want to leave you with is, as we're seeing all these content, all these things around, it could be better. It was better for whom?
Thank you. We have time for one more, I think. So we'll go right here.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here and for your leadership and being an inspiration. My name is Estelle. I'm a graduate student in the School of Foreign Service. My question is mostly for you, but if either of you also have anything to add, I'd love to hear it. I think it's really interesting to talk about the first question about the difference between perceptions of inequality and actual inequality. And as someone that grew up on the internet, I think it's no surprise to see the state of people that grew up on the internet today, particularly young men. And I think it's interesting to hear a lot of dialogue about that, and then also be seeing the ways that people are being oppressed and marginalized by systems in reality at the same time. And something that's concerning for me as someone that wants to go into public service and be in advocacy in these things is thinking about that the generation of young people, and particularly young men that are growing up on this content right now, are the people that I'm going to have to work with and be in community with. And that can be a bit daunting. And so my question is, if anyone has advice on, how do you go through and with integrity and with grace, but also with, self-protection, dealing with people that have been radicalized or even just to a lesser degree? And also, to what extent is that de-radicalization women's responsibilities, and to what extent does it need to be men that are, finding a role in de-radicalizing and getting people out of those spirals?
Great question. So maybe it's because I'm a nerdy academic, but I find it's a lot easier for me to explain something if I try to understand, like, from within the perspective, right? So, and so even to grapple with kind of like hate that comes your way, or being confronted with hostile opinions, let's say. So one of the things I did in this book that's coming out in the fall is analyze my own hate mail. And because I started to realize a pattern in the hate mail from men, which is that it was kinetic. It always involved motion. And they all wanted me to go somewhere. And so if you strip away all the awfulness from the hate mail, it was like, why are you always front and center? Why are people like you always front and center? Usually there's like a mistake in there. So that one was, why are you transsexuals always front and center? And then it was like, he called back and left a second message to correct his first hate message, and with like regular old misogyny, but it also was still focused on front and center, or go back under a rock, or go back in the shithole, or go to Russia. And like, it was all like, it's constantly, and that's send them back, lock her up, get back in the closet, right? Like this containment, that's the name of that chapter, right? And it is about putting people back in their place. And that really helped me. Like now when hate mail comes in, I'm like, ooh, does it fit the pattern? Like, yes, it does. Another data point, like in my analysis. And so, maybe that's my coping mechanism, is to understand the pattern, because that helps me understand, okay, if this is about containment, then what is it that's so threatening about having people that don't look like you in front of you on the TV or on the podium or on the stage? Now I can start to understand what an intervention might look like. What is it that we need to do? Because I understand what the threat is, or I understand the fear, right? That there's some kind of fear, there's some kind of threat, there's some kind of discomfort with a woman or a trans person or someone Jewish, like things that they often think I am not. And so I get anti-Semitic or anti-trans or whatever it is, and that bothers them too, right? They can't, I must be this other thing, right? Because, so I think, that's not a coping mechanism that everyone would want to pursue, and I didn't do it until I was 50, and so, I think I had to build up some resilience myself, but I mean that by actually engaging in conversation with people, and this is the Splenda problem, right? Which is people, it's hard. One of the things we know about de-radicalization from conspiracy theories, for example, is the only real evidence that we have about what works is engaging with curiosity and empathy over an extended period of time with someone who trusts you, right? So that's hard. That's really hard to do. But we know the opposite also doesn't work, which is shunning and shutting out. And so to the extent that you can forge ties and have conversations and continually challenge in an empathetic way, driven by curiosity and not by shaming, That is the only evidence that we have of what can pull people back together and have respectful dialogue around areas that might move forward and might pull people out of some of those rabbit holes.
I just want to acknowledge that that's really hard.
Yeah.
And it's a lot to carry, and it's scary. I think, we are seeing violence against women in this moment. A lot of the funding that has been available through the Office of Violence Against Women, there's like one grant portal that is now open versus many. That there is an opportunity, I think, for us also to talk about, though, like when there's domestic violence, when there's violence in the home, it doesn't stay behind closed doors, right? It spills out into the streets and into our communities. And that there's a role, right, for all of us to play there. But it's something I think about a lot. And as a survivor and a child witness, that playing small is one of the ways that I think many of us who've had that similar experience have stayed safe. It doesn't necessarily serve us in this moment, but I also just want to acknowledge that this is a dance that many of us do. And so, to your point of building those relationships and building those connections and also keeping yourself safe, I think is important. And for those of us who can help create conditions where some of those dialogues can happen, but also for other young men to speak to other young men, I think it's critical. So I just wanted to acknowledge it's really hard, and I don't have all the answers, but carry some of that too. And it's for those of you who are starting out in your career, it's a lot. It's a lot to carry, and we want to continue to do everything we can to make safe spaces for everybody. So I see you.
Thank you. Yeah, leaning in and making safe spaces for all of us, right, in this moment, so we can all be resilient and build these communities of care and flourishing. All right, well, please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. I've learned so much tonight, so thank you so much. Thank you all again for being here, and I hope that you'll check out our table out there. If you are a student, we are accepting applications for our student fellowship program in the fall, so please sign up and apply. We'd encourage you to do that. Feel free to talk to us after if you're interested. Also, make sure you register for our upcoming series of workshops on how to build tools and develop tools for things like community organizing and advocacy and having courageous conversations and holding boundaries when you need them. We're offering workshops this month to really develop those tools, so I hope that you'll sign up for those with us as well. All right, let's thank our panel one more time, and thank you all.